Slavic, East European, and Eurasian languages and cultures. Yes, all of this, at the University of Los Angeles, and a very famous and highly regarded scholar of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet film and literature, plus comparative literature, critical gender studies, and film history and theory. Lilya is the associate editor for media and film, the author of the associate editor for media and film of the Russian Review, I guess, right? The author of the books How the Soviet Man Was Unmade and The Voice of Technology, Soviet Cinema's Transition to Sound, as well as many edited volumes, including Arctic Cinemas and the documentary Ethos, Sound, Speech, Music in Soviet and Post-Soviet Cinema, Mad Men, Mad World, Sex, Politics, Style, and the 60s. And today, Lilya is talking about Sergei Loznitsa and his documentary cinema.
Yes. Thank you so much.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, of course, for coming. I'm very happy always to be back at Columbia and at the Harriman Institute. So thank you for Tanya and Mark too for the very kind invitation. So I'll start. Sergei Loznitsa's 2014 documentary film Maidan captures with an objective, unblinking gaze the events of the Ukrainian Revolution, often now referred to as the Revolution of Dignity, that began with peaceful protests against then President Viktor Yanukovych's regime and ended with his fleeing the capital for Russia on February 21st, 2014. The film was shot over 3 months on location in Kiev's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, with 3 static cameras positioned around the square, taking in the events unfolding before them. First, the everyday, almost banal life of an Occupy-type movement, with tents, makeshift kitchens, amateur poets, political speeches, and music, to a brutal confrontation with the police and Berkut, the special ops teams, forces that cost almost 100 lives, not counting the wounded and those missing in action. The film is divided into 4 parts: prologue, triumph, armed conflict, and postscriptum, during which the camera moves only once. 1 hour into the film, and almost exactly in the middle of the narrative, when the riot police attack the journalist's tent and our cameraman is forced to flee, taking his recording equipment with him, but never turning it off. This suddenly jarring movement is a direct signal to us, the viewers, that the film and the events unfolding before us have taken on a different character, that we have gone from mere observation to direct participation. The film was shot over 3 months and made for a Ukrainian audience, at first simply to document the event. The idea for the film, as well as Loznitsa's austere aesthetic that favored the stationary planted camera, was born right away as soon as the protests began on December 1st, 2013. Loznitsa and a small camera crew arrived in Kiev on December 15th as practically the only documentary film crew to grasp the historical significance of the events unfolding before them. Quote, "For the first time in my long career as a documentary filmmaker, I began to follow real-life events that unfolded in front of me," Loznitsa explained in his interview with Radio Liberty. "The goal is to take the viewer to Maidan and show 90 days of the revolution." The film, therefore, is not any individual story, not of any one leader or character or even the director himself, but the story of a people, of a movement, and of a mass. What Loznitsa is attempting to document here is a revolution not simply in the Ukrainian streets, but in the Ukrainian people, a profound change taking place in Ukrainian society. This is simultaneously an anti-colonial revolution, a mental revolution against Russian power, and an anti-Soviet revolution that attempts to finally dismantle the Soviet state inside every individual. Born in Belarus, Sergei Loznitsa grew up in Ukraine, graduating from the Kiev Polytechnical Institute with a degree in math and engineering. He worked in cybernetics before entering the State Film Institute, GEEK, in Moscow in 1991 to study as a film director. And in 2000, he began working in St. Petersburg Documentary Film Studio, and then shortly after moved to Berlin, to Germany, where he still lives and works. To date, Loznitsa has compiled over 20 short and documentary films and 5 feature films, of which Maidan, Donbass from 2018, Babi Yar, Context, the most recent one from 21, all deal with specifically Ukrainian topics. His film My Joy, Счастье Moyo in 2010 was the first Ukrainian film ever to compete for the Palme d'Or. And Donbass was selected as the Ukrainian entry for Best Foreign Language Film at the 91st Academy Awards, for which Loznitsa also received the Alexander Davzhenko State Prize of Ukraine to honor his outstanding contribution to the development of Ukrainian cinema. In the context of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, however, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Loznitsa's refusal to define himself via singular linguistic or national identity, even as he proclaims himself a Ukrainian filmmaker, his residence in the West and his Russian language films have put him on the defensive. His simultaneous identification with and refusal of national identity marks Loznitsa firmly as a post-Soviet filmmaker, a category that comfortably existed from the collapse of the USSR in 1991 up until the events of Maidan of 2014. Since then, it has become clear that the idea of a shared cultural past was yet another myth being weaponized to support Russia's imperial and colonialist ambitions to once again control the regions of the former USSR without regard for their national borders or self-determination. While many of Loznitsa's films, both documentary and fiction, speak to the complexities of the present, his archival films are attempts to come to terms with the legacy of Stalinism and the trauma of the Soviet past. It is that past that is at stake in his two most recent, and when I say recent for Loznitsa, it means he's already made 5 more films since I last wrote this. His two most recent compilation documentaries, The Trial, Protsess from 2018, and State Funeral, Государственные Pokhorony from 2019, which I will be speaking about today, and which, like his earlier Blockade from 2005 and Review from 2008, were edited together from Soviet archival footage. I argue that despite their temporal remove, Loznitsa positions himself and the viewer in these works not as a distant observer of historical events, but as, following Michael Rothberg, an implicated subject. For Rothberg, the notion of the implicated subject stems from a belief that our understanding of power, privilege, violence, and injustice suffers, quote unquote, from an underdeveloped vocabulary, an inability to describe what Hannah Arendt called this vicarious responsibility for things we have not done. That is, for the manifold indirect, structural, and collective forms of agency that enable injury, exploitation, and domination, but that frequently remain in the shadows. Derived from the Latin stem implicare, meaning to entangle, involve, or connect closely, implication draws attention to how we are folded into, implicated in, events that at first seem beyond our agency as individual subjects. For Rothberg, an implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather, quote, a participant in histories and social formations that generate the positions of the victim and perpetrator, and yet in which most people do not occupy such clear-cut roles. Loznitsa's archival films, therefore, serve not only as the return of the repressed, and actually quite literally so, because his State Funeral, for instance, was a film that was never shown in the USSR, but also to articulate a connection between history and our current moment, to show the ways we are implicated in the events of the past. To do so, I want to say Loznitsa utilizes the film form most closely associated with the Soviet avant-garde documentary, specifically the documentary practices of, you want that one?
Thank you.
The documentary practices of Dziga, Vertov, Elizaveta Svilova, and Esfit Shub. And you're seeing the poster for Vertov and Svilova's Kinoglas on your left, and Shub's Fall of the Romanov Dynasty on your right, both from the 1920s. Which is to say that the compilation or montage documentary assembled from earlier, often unedited footage, a kind of factory effect. So part one of a trilogy about the USSR called The Event, Sobytie from 2015, reclaimed footage shot during the days following the attempted right-wing push on August 19, 1991. So that was his first film that he made about the Soviet period, right? He made a film about the very end. And if that film, The Event, documented the birth of democratic Russia from the ashes of the totalitarian regime, and here I'll show you just a couple of slides from that, right? So this one says, everyone to support the Lenin Council or Lenin Soviet. Fascism will not stand. And And here's another one. This says, you know, party hacks. For 73 years, you've been killing the people. For 73 years, you've been mangling the nature and ecology. For 73 years, you've been corrupting everyone. It's enough. We've had enough. And then this one just says no, right? Нет. So this is sort of documentation of the birth of a democratic Russia from the ashes of a totalitarian regime. Then in some sense, the films that follow, which is The Trial from 2018 and State Funeral, chronicle that dream's demise. Though because of their historical context, they initially appear to be one step removed from our present moment. Trial, whose Russian title Protsess, the process, is meant to suggest Franz Kafka's novel. Here, Loznitsa condenses found footage of the 13-day show trial of the Industrial Party into just over 2 hours, alternating bureaucratic procedure and fabricated testimony with snippets of popular demonstrations. And this is the title from the film. To produce what Lawrence Garcia calls a nonfiction account of a fastidiously composed fiction. Importantly, Loznitsa's film stresses the spectacular nature of the hearings and the role of the audience, including members of the public, allowed inside the column hall of the House of the Soviets in Moscow, and the masses picketing outside, and audiences listening to the proceedings on the radio in 1930. And finally, of course, ourselves, now placed in the position of bearing witness to events unfolding on the screen. No audience here is innocent. Rather, we are all implicated subjects, part of the process or protsess and the operations of power that produced this trial as a traumatic event. So the 1930 trial of the Industrial Party, Protsess Prompartii, documented in Loznitsa's film, was the third major and very well publicized trial of internal Soviet enemies, following the trial of the Socialist Revolutionaries in 22 and the Shakhty affair in 28. And as Julie Cassidy has shown, it helps to cement the theatrical and cinematic conventions that form the all-encompassing script of the Great Terror. The theatrical or show nature of the trials translated into how the trial was documented and reported to the Soviet people. So in 22, for instance, we see in Kino Pravda number 8. So this was the Kino Pravda that covered the trial of the right socialist revolutionaries, and it covered it. If you know anything about Kino Pravda, usually it's a sort of collection of factual material. This one is formed as a kind of fictional vignette. It was directed by Dziga Vertov, and it starred, so to speak, Mikhail Kaufman, one of his cameramen, and Ivan Bilyakov, another one of his cameramen, and Alexander Lemberg, another one of his cameramen, and even Vertov himself. And it really played up the theatricality of the proceedings by opening the newsreel with an entirely staged event. We are shown two men, these two, Kaufman and Bilyakov, discussing the trial and betting on the outcome. They will definitely be shot, says one of them, обязательно расстреляют, before taking us inside the House of the Soviets in Moscow. The dramatic element of the proceedings is emphasized by 3 days of deliberation, rather than cutting straight to the verdict, as for instance, the Pate newsreel does of the same event. Vertov deliberately shows us a period of waiting. We see a hand repeatedly turning a clock forward 24 hours, a sign on a closed door that deliberations are in progress, pages from a day calendar, empty chairs, et cetera, people falling asleep. Finally, we understand that the verdict has been pronounced when we see another young man, Lemberg in this case, buy a newspaper from a kiosk, people crowding around to read the wall newspaper, and Vertov himself leaning out of a tram to buy the newspaper from a street vendor. And then also Vertov sharing it with a woman next to him on the tram. Oddly enough, this Kino Pravda then takes us to switches to other news items, including footage from an aircraft accident, the restoration of tram line number 13. And here's our tram, and the uses of a tank in peacetime. And in fact, the staged nature of the trial proceedings becomes even more evident in contrast with these factual coverage of these everyday events. The show documentary films of the 1930s took their cue from this newsreel, from the Kino Pravda #8, in which cinematic editing gave the trial a kind of newfound narrative continuity. And the turning point was, in fact, the 1930 trial of the Industrial Party, which was done as a film called 13 dni, Protsess Prompartii, and directed by Yakov Paselsky and edited into a 42-minute documentary sound film in 1931. The sound footage was shot by Semyonov using a mixed sound camera and that was developed by Alexander Shorin, and the main cinematographer credited on the film was, in fact, the former Kinok Ivan Belyakov. So we had just seen him. The trial took place from November 25th to December 7th, 1930, making it likely the second full-length documentary sound film that was shot in the USSR after Vertov's Enthusiasm from 1931. So Paselsky's film opens with a static shot. This is the main, usually the main, you can see the sound camera actually here. Opens with a static shot of a stack of legal documents, Dela 38, number 38, after which we see defendants brought in by car to the back of the House of the Soviets, the spectators filling the hall, and the call to order as the trial begins. The emphasis on the audience is telling. This is a people's trial in which the audience, both inside and outside the courtroom, plays a key role. We see shots of the crowded hall, audience members shielding their eyes from the intensity of the floodlights, reactions to shots of what is happening on the dais before them. Borrowing from Vertov's Kino Pravda editing techniques, Paselsky also cuts away to the streets, showing us masses of protesters carrying slogans demanding the execution of traitors. So this says, "Требуем расстрела," we demand that they be shot. Condensing the 13-day trial into a 42-minute film, Paselsky plays fast and loose with the depositions, splicing together footage clearly shot on different days to produce a narrative of guilt, confession, and repentance that demonstrates the smooth functioning of the machinery of the state. The focus of the film is on the defendants' sincere repentance, rather than the acts of sabotage they were said to have committed. One after another, using nearly the same language, the engineers on trial narrate their involvement in the attempt by foreign interventionists to disrupt the 5-year plan, acknowledge their guilt, beg for forgiveness from the people of the USSR, and ask for a chance to redeem themselves through work. At times, Belyakov's camera becomes restless and pans around the room as if looking for something other than the speaker making his well-rehearsed confession, as if the confession was something embarrassing, or perhaps so unimportant to the outcome of the proceedings so as not to warrant our full attention. Indeed, in the final segment devoting to the sentencing, we see almost no reaction from the defendants as their sentences, 10 years of imprisonment for some, execution for others, are read aloud. Paselsky's film concludes with a series of intertitles describing the leniency of the Soviet government toward those who openly confess their guilt. So this is the fact that the process has revealed to all of the before the entire proletarian world the class enemy. But the Soviet Union is very lenient, and so they have communed all of their sentences from execution to 10 years imprisonment, and followed by general warning to the viewers to stay vigilant. It is clear from all of the editing choices and the fate of the defendant that the fate of the defendants is known in advance, and that the 13 days of trial are a theatrical performance of justice for the benefit of the state. So, as to be expected, Loznitsa's film shows us the parts that don't fit so neatly into this well-rehearsed and organized narrative of crime and punishment. But rather than starting with the arrival of the defendants, the trial opens somewhat unexpectedly, with shots of tramline number 13. The same tram line, in other words, that we saw being repaired in Vertov's Kino Pravda. We see the tram approach the camera from the same angle, but now in deep winter, and follow its movements as it crisscrosses Moscow, driving along the Bolshoi Kamenny Bridge, past the original, not yet destroyed Cathedral of Christ the Savior, past the Kremlin walls, to stop in front of the House of the Soviets, where the trial is going to take place. On the one hand, this opening sequence serves to orient us in place and time, but it might also be a comment on the documentary process itself. Associated with Kino Pravda, We infer that this tram is literally bringing Belyakov and others to the House of the Soviets to document the proceedings. After this opening prologue, Loznitsa's film joins up with Pasiersky's as we watch the defendants arrive by car to the building and be led by soldiers inside to await trial. And I'm going to play you this clip, and hopefully everything will work. As always, Loznitsa cleans up the image and adds diegetic sound, increasing our awareness of the spectacular and recorded nature of events unfolding before us. We hear the sounds of the engine as the cars pull up, a sequence that's without sound in the original, while the corrected playback speed and slightly different choices of editing allow us to see the soldiers looking at the camera and the defendants turning away as they walk past. We hear dogs barking in the distance, a sound that evokes the prison camp to which the defendants will be sentenced, and the slam of a heavy metal door as it shuts behind them as we cut to the one-word film title, Protsess. Loznitsa's film is at least twice as long as Pasiersky's, and Loznitsa stays longer on shots of the defendants and the audience, especially on people looking directly at the camera. His editing also emphasizes the slow and awkward nature of the proceedings. Frequent coughing, the rustling of papers by the prosecution, the restlessness of the spectators, the evident heat of the hall, and the nervousness of the defendants who speak in low voices, stammer, drink water, and shuffle their feet. There is a remarkable degree of verbal sparring between the defendants and the prosecution, which is footage entirely absent from Pasiersky's film, disagreements between the defendants with each other, and rejections of certain interpretations of events by the court. In other words, rather than a clean, well-rehearsed series of confessions as seen in Pasiersky's film, we understand instead that the defendants were much less passive and the proceedings much less choreographed than the officially constructed film version suggested. We're no longer witnessing a well-run trial conducted by a well-oiled state machine, but rather a somewhat desperate prosecution attempting to badger the defendants into agreeing on its narrative of events, based not on testimony or facts, but on an obviously constructed lie. At the same time, we are also shown the collaboration of all the parties, the prosecution, the defendants, witnesses, judges, spectators, and journalists in the creation of this lie. We see a witness brought in to corroborate a voluntary statement by one of the defendants, inadvertently implicate himself, be arrested, and forced to confess, repent, and beg for forgiveness. Similarly, Loznitsa includes the prosecutor Krylenko's impassioned speech calling for the death penalty for all of the defendants, which is met with thunderous applause. In this way, Loznitsa stresses the collective guilt of all who take part in this trial, and including ourselves seated in the theater. We are all implicated in the process and its aftermath. We are all responsible for the loss of innocent lives and for helping the state to perpetuate its lies. Like Pasiersky, Loznitsa ends his film with Vyshinsky's reading of the sentences of the accused and the title cards giving us the consequences of the trial. While the state commuted all of the death sentences to 10 years imprisonment, we learn that almost all of the men that we have been watching, including the persecutors Vyshinsky and Krylenko, either perished in the camps, were rearrested, or executed as enemies of the people, except for Vyshinsky, who committed suicide. Almost none survived the Great Terror, and almost none lived past 1938. A telling moment caught on film and included by both Pasiersky and Loznitsa shows us Vyshinsky seized by a coughing fit in the middle of reading out the sentences. And I'll actually play you this moment. So he's going to, you're going to see him reading so this is them being sentenced. And you're going to see him reading very, very, very quickly all of these, the statutes, right, that under which they're being imprisoned. A telling moment caught on film and included by both Pasiersky, so it shows Wyszynski seized by a coughing fit in the middle of reading out the sentences. It is a moment that must be understood psychoanalytically as somatic compliance. When the hysteric's body begins to act out the trauma, it cannot put into language. Wyszynski literally cannot get the words out, and his body becomes the site of the collective unprocessed trauma of the crimes of the Soviet state. And if you've ever seen the act of killing, the end of the act of killing has the perpetrator who's been interviewed the whole time and has been sort of talking about how easy it was to kill all the people that he has killed. He goes back to the place to the balcony where he actually killed people, and he begins to dry heave, and it clearly is coming out of his body. His body begins to sort of do the thing that he cannot say or understand, and I think exactly the same thing is happening here. So this is a title card for Krylenko, who was the prosecutor. All right. State funeral. Государственные похороны was Loznitsa's second found footage film of the Stalin period, chronicles the final procession, funeral and commemoration of the death of Joseph Stalin, based on shot footage that no one ever saw. A 46-minute film called The Great Farewell, Великое Прощание, from 1953, shot by over 200 cameramen all over the USSR and edited by 6 leading Soviet directors to commemorate Stalin's death, but never shown during the Soviet period. The 6 directors responsible for this version of the film included the fiction film directors Grigory Alexandrov, Sergei Gerasimov, and Mikhail Choareli, and the documentary directors Yelizaveta Svilova, Ilya Kapalin, and Irina Setkina. Their numbers seems to speak both to the mixed genre of the proceedings, so 3 of them are fiction film directors and 3 of them are documentary, and the attempt to spread or share the responsibility for the film beyond any one individual. According to Ilya Kapalin, editorial work on the film was shrouded in secrecy and confusion, where directives changed almost daily. The feature-length film was compiled in April of 1953, but shelved shortly after. A 38-minute version was shown on Russian state television in 1991, and a 46-minute version in 2012. Loznitsa reclaims this footage, shot in the 4 days of the funeral, to tell a different story other than the one story of national mourning imagined by Soviet propaganda, with its upbeat ending pointing to a bright future. In fact, the basic structure of the original film, this one, The Great Farewell, was clearly taken from Dziga Vertov's 1934 Three Songs of Lenin, which served as a cinematic model for a nation grieving the loss of its leader. In The Great Farewell, the opening shots show us now the empty places. In The Great Farewell, the opening shots show us the now empty places associated with Stalin, followed by shots of newspapers carrying the announcement of his death from all over the USSR and countries of the Eastern Bloc, followed by streams of people traveling to Moscow to bear witness to this moment of national loss. The first part of the film is devoted to the funeral, with Stalin's body lying in state in the columns in the House of the Soviets, while the central segment focuses on the speeches of Politburo members delivered from the top of the Lenin mausoleum. As in Vertov's film, we see the grieving masses, members of the Central Committee, Stalin's children, delegates from all over the globe, soldiers and ordinary citizens file past the open casket. Chopin's Marche Funèbre, that opens the second song of Vertov's film, here accompanies scenes of Stalin's casket being carried into the Lenin mausoleum, now renamed Stalin, the Lenin-Stalin mausoleum. Similarly, Vertov's moment of silence, filmed as a moment of immobility with trains, planes, people, and heavy industry all come to a halt, is repeated here. And like Three Songs, The Great Farewell ends with a montage of industrialization that promised to continue the work began by Lenin and Stalin. It is no wonder, in fact, that the 1953 film resembled Vertov's model so closely. Of the 6 directors responsible for its completion, 2 were members of the original Kino group, Yelizaveta Svilova and Ilya Kapalin, along with Sima Pompanska, who was assistant director on The Great Farewell. The 3 would later then work together to restore Vertov's Three Songs of Lenin in the 1970s. Rather than celebrating the life of the great leader, Loznitsa's film State Funeral marks the moment when Stalin's empire begins to collapse. As Loznitsa himself notes, the raw footage of the funeral serves as a kind of time machine, a return of the repressed past that can now be seen in its entirety. From the start, Loznitsa veers away from his predecessors by opening State Funeral not with shots of the empty places associated with the great leader, but with Stalin's coffin being carried into the House of the Soviets. The very first shot is in color, which is what you're seeing right here, with a bright red of the cloth covering the casket and turquoise blue of the funeral van standing in stark contrast to the gray-brown street and building facade and the black-gray uniforms of the soldiers and Politburo members. Inside, we see the familiar shots of Stalin framed exactly like Vertov's earlier shots of Lenin, lying in state surrounded by palm trees and flowers. But the next set of close-ups of Stalin's dead body, first in color, then in black and white. So first in color with his white face and chest covered with medals, and then another black and white of his hands. And then an overhead shot, again in color, of Stalin's body surrounded by, almost drowning in flowers, closes off this preamble before cutting to the black before cutting to black and the title of the film, State Funeral. The close-ups and overhead shots are unfamiliar and feel almost disrespectful. We are too close or somehow hovering too much above the dead body, the camera giving us a perspective we were never meant to have. And in fact, camera placement is really key here. Loznitsa uses footage shot from cameramen standing right next to the coffin without ever giving us a reverse shot, never showing us what they see, but only the act of looking. And the result is uncanny. Not only are we seeing the mourners from Stalin's perspective, but their proximity to the camera and the camera's proximity to Stalin's casket forces many to look directly at us as they file past. And I'm going to play you this sequence as well. And so watch as the people go by. It's not all of them, of course, but they will be. They will look at us. All right. As in all of his films, Loznitsa is interested in the individuals that make up the masses in whose name the state rules. But there's something else here as well. Direct address to the viewer, the eyes of the past looking directly and unflinchingly at us. We are witness here to what French film scholar Antoine Debac calls eruptions of history. So the transference of the direct look to camera, first found in footage of concentration camps, that then finds itself a key element in post-war European film. Where did this gaze, this head-on intensity come from, asks Debac. From history, not specifically from the history of cinema, but rather from a blind spot of 20th century history, its unrepresentability, which is nonetheless staring right at us. The looks to camera in Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald that are then repeated in Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and other films tells us, quote, that cinema had to change because nobody could remain innocent after these images, neither filmmakers nor spectators, neither actors nor characters. Moreover, the eyes staring into the lens and at us are part and parcel of the century in its films, the highest evidence of the encounter of history and cinema. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. This is from Mikhail Rom's Обыкновенный Fascism, the ordinary fascism, and this is the when they go to Auschwitz. But this is how Rom shows them to us in his film, right? He shows them to us directly looking at us. Loznitsa ends his film twice. The main body of the film concludes with the all-gun salute, followed by 5 minutes of silence. Here again, as in Three Songs of Lenin, filmed as 5 minutes of motionless and immobility, with trains, sleds, factories all over the country coming to a standstill, people and machines caught in mid-motion, while the use of the freeze frame underscores this moment as a break in the experience of cinematic and historical time. But the next set of shots does not show us the USSR continuing Stalin's work through dynamic editing of industrial achievements, as we have come to expect. Instead, we see a giant crane slowly moving a portrait of Stalin across a massive construction site over the heads of the workers who have to duck to avoid being decapitated, and that's them up there. So it moves right over their heads. As you can see, it's very low. Until the crane mechanism appears to jam midway. We watch the portrait swinging pointlessly in the air before a cut takes us to a group of men exiting through a metal door. Perhaps these are the workers responsible for operating the crane. They step out onto the ledge, their funeral Stalin badge is clearly visible. We hear the metal door creak and slam behind them as the film cuts to black. Ambient noise signals to us that the film is not over. And indeed, the next shots take us back to crowds on Red Square and to the only non-diegetic music of the entire film, a lullaby performed by Sergei Loznitsa. As we watch people file past the Lenin-Stalin mausoleum, it's here, the Lenin-Stalin mausoleum. Looking at all the wreaths that have been brought to commemorate Stalin's life. I don't have that slide. The choice of lullaby is not incidental, but is yet a further reference to Vertov. In this case, to the 1937 film Lullaby, Kolыбельная, which tried to pay tribute to Stalin and his cult of personality. And this is this still from the film. In that film, Vertov created a portrait of Stalin as the literal father of the people, repeated, of course, at his funeral, with the whole of the USSR comprised only of Stalin, women, and children, a country without men. Loznitsa's choice of music and the slow, uninterrupted shots of funeral wreaths being laid before the mausoleum allow us to show something else that we maybe hadn't seen before. Suddenly, we cannot help but understand the wreaths as evidence of Stalinist crimes, marking the millions of dead. The closing title card confirms this suspicion. As in the trial, Loznitsa ends his film by reminding us of the consequences of Stalinism. Quote, over 27 million Soviet citizens murdered, executed, tortured to death, imprisoned, sent to the Gulag labor camps, or deported during Stalin's rule. A further estimated 15 million starved to death. This closing message and here are the wreaths. This closing message is there both to remind us of historical facts and to pose a question about what we have just watched, about our own implication in the crimes of the past. While seemingly avoiding the imposition of an authorial voice and letting the events simply unfold before our eyes, Loznitsa's montage films are as much a statement about Russia's present as they are documents of its Soviet past. Together, the trial and state funeral serve as a warning about the cult of personality, about blindly following the dictates of the state, about our own implication as viewers and as citizens in the crimes of that state, both historic and present day. What we see, says Loznitsa, in the film, снятом виде, has nothing to do with objective reality, объективность. The film, he says, fastens, фиксирует, the observed and the observer into a single inseparable unity. And this is from his manifesto from 2005. In his review of Loznitsa's Babi Yar from 2022, A.O. Scott notes that what the film displays most vividly is the intense individuality of anonymous, ordinary people. History, he writes, is a catalog of faces, city dwellers and peasants, victims and perpetrators and bystanders, Germans, Jews, Russians, Ukrainians. Rather than history with a capital H itself, or its distortions through media, of which documentary film is one tool, it is these individualized, anonymous, ordinary people that I take to be the focus of Loznitsa's found footage films. It is their reactions, their participation and implication, their acts of complicity or resistance, their direct gaze that Loznitsa repeatedly captures in his films. Over and again, Loznitsa's films force us into the uncomfortable space of the implicated subject, neither victim nor perpetrator, but folded into, sutured, to use cinematic language, into the traumatic events of our own history. Fixing the observer and observed into one inseparable unit, the trial and state funeral allow us to see the void that another writer, Evgenia Belorusets, quoting her father, a German language literary translator, called dead empire. Quote, an empire that no longer lives and cannot live, but that nevertheless strikes and kills in the name of its impossible return. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lilya. Thank you. Questions? I have a question. Was that end card talking about all the deaths? Was that part of the original documentary?
No.
That was after.
That was after. Yeah. No, the original ones are all celebratory.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin's work lives on. Look at how well we're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Started by his kid.
Yeah.
I have a question about the audience. I know
Yeah.
that for Vertov it's so important, the shots of the audience and
Yeah.
the film that you showed, the shots from Kino, Pravda.
Yeah.
The original has quite an emphasis on the audience in the
Mhm.
hall.
Yeah.
Does Loznitsa play with that motive at all? Like, does he focus us on the audience in a way that would allow for a direct identification between people in the room?
In the room.
And
Yeah.
people watching.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, particularly for the trial, if you compare the two versions, which I have done slowly watching the 42-minute film and the 2-hour film and seeing where sort of what he adds in and what he includes. I think there's a lot, but the original film was also part of the audience was part of the thing, right? You were always supposed to feel part of the events. You were always supposed to recognize yourself as an audience. It's just that as a Soviet citizen, you were supposed to be so happy to be participating in this form of justice. And as I think post-Soviet or wherever it is that we are, I think we're supposed to see it from a different position. That's my argument is that by showing us exactly the same shots, but he's now completely repositioned us and vis-a-vis the original audience and footage.
The Ukrainian Revolution you started
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
How does that carry over into the world today? Like those feelings,
Yeah. For
or just the general people? I mean, just like
yeah.
I know it's not homogenous, but I mean,
Yeah.
how do those feelings carry into the war?
In Russia or
Oh
in
no, with the
Ukraine,
Ukrainians. Yeah.
Ukrainians, yeah.
Because they already felt a certain way against their government, and now there's this presence, and how I don't know. it sounds
Yeah, I mean, they got rid of their Soviet-backed government in 2014.
Russian.
Yeah, Russian. Their Russian-backed government in 2014, right? So I think that, I mean, if you even look at the fact that the Maidan was February 21st and Russia invaded February 22nd, that 12 years later. I think the dates are even are not even incidental. I think it's a direct relationship to what happened in 2014 before the invasion of Crimea. So yeah, no, the part of the issue with sort of between Ukraine and Loznitsa was that Loznitsa both identifies himself as a Ukrainian filmmaker but didn't want to be nationalist and nationalistic at a moment where I think it was not quite the right move to not be nationalists. And so they got into a big fight. Ukrainian film industry.
The first thing I'd say is in response to what you just said, which I think is exactly the right move, but not very popular in Ukraine.
Well, it wasn't popular when he did it. Yeah.
But can you go back to the French critic?
Yeah. The French critic, yes. Yeah. Getting there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't understand the first quote, so I wanted to look at it again.
Where did this gaze, this head-on intensity come from?
Yes.
Yeah.
From history.
From history, yeah. So he's making a decision. Sorry, I cut out a piece that maybe was missing there. So what he's talking about is the fact is all of this direct look to camera that happens in fiction post-war films in Europe. And the fact that cinema used to have there used to be direct gazes to camera in cinema in early cinema, usually for comic purposes. This is slightly different in the USSR because Soviet film actually does this differently, but he's a French scholar, so he's looking at French. So for comic films, they would sort of break the fourth wall. They would directly address the viewer, do that thing, right? And he's talking about the fact that something shifted after, essentially after Auschwitz. In that after you have all of the films that documented the atrocities in the camps, and you have the series of photographs, the same ones that Rome uses as well, of all of these people looking directly at us, that this isn't cinema history, this is history, as in art history. I know you're a historian, so you don't like it. I know, I understand.
But but that's what I was curious about. So, I mean, the unrepresentability of anything after Auschwitz is, famous quote of Adorno or someone, right? How are we going to have
poetry after Auschwitz?
Yeah, poetry after Auschwitz.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But of course we did, and we do, and we have lots. So I'm just wondering. I'm just pushing you to maybe say a little bit more about why he's talking about this, or why looking into the camera at this point is somehow connected with that. Like I don't quite see its connection with the implicated subject, which I think is absolutely spot on. Perfect.
So the eye contact between them and us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think you need Auschwitz here. I don't think you need the Holocaust here, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm not completely convinced by it either. I mean, I'd want to see more.
Yeah.
I guess I'd want to see more intentionality, which is not really your thing, but I'd want to see that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I thought
you don't like the word history, I know.
No, I do. I just like it when non-historians. Anyway, really, I mean, it's very historically minded among non-historians. So I would just want more. I would want more about that. And I'm a little bit skeptical of the actual direct connection with the Holocaust here. Or just a little, doesn't really do that much for me.
Yeah.
But I was really, really struck by the scenes of the that you showed of the people, walking past Stalin. Because I watched that film, but of course I fast forwarded through that.
Yeah.
Because it goes on forever.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciated your pointing out just how uncanny they are, right?
Yeah.
Well,
because there's lots of shots, right? So literally the cameramen were all positioned about like 100 to 200 yards. So what Loznitsa can do is literally like one set of shots ends and you can pick up on the same person from a different cameraman, right? Like as they walk past, like you can trace the same person going up the stairs and going into the hall, and right. They've documented every single step of all of this stuff, right? But you never see that moment where they walk like right past, sort of right in front of your face, i.e. the camera. And I thought that was so interesting. Just and obviously their facial expressions vary massively and radically, right? Some are genuinely in tears, others less genuinely, others are just something.
Well, what really struck me was the way you couldn't always tell the difference between grief and fear.
Yeah.
That they really, really seem to blur and overlap with each other, even in the same people.
Yeah.
And I think he used the music to emphasize specific moments that blur this is just a comment and praise for your argument about the indicated subject, because I think it works perfectly in that scene. And I think that the music really helps sort of focus on moments where we're looking at the subject people, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out.
And I don't know. So one question one could ask him is, he's using all of the original music that you can hear in the original film, but he's clearly amplifying it, and he's clearly right. So my question is, like, I'm not going to say 100%. Well, yeah, I'm not going to say 100% for those shots that was the original music behind them, but I think it was probably.
And so who did the score? Sorry, if there are other questions, I can.
I don't remember, but he's got a whole team that he works on restoring everything. So restoring image, restoring color, restoring sound, or adding sound and adding set. So if you know his work kind of on the archival films, one of the issues that everyone has is the fact that he adds sound to the original archive films. So particularly this was an issue with blockade, which is the Leningrad blockade, and done from the film documents there, which were all without sound, and so he adds just a little bit of ambient noise. So you'll hear a bird chirping, or you'll hear water, or it's not a tram. Like it won't be a lot. It's just there to kind of give it a little bit of life and presence. And at least in one interview that, when I talked to him, he said it basically makes you feel like you're there, right? It's to give the audience the feeling of being there. But of course, kind of strict documentary scholars, like, you can't do that. You can't go and adding, sound to where there isn't sound. You can't go, right? That's already fake.
There's a moment where we had a woman falling.
Yeah.
Like that has been added.
Yeah. I don't know if it right. Because some of that,
the way that the music was,
it's certainly been amplified so we can hear it. So very famously, there's a moment in Sobytie in the event where you see these people running by and somebody shouts Volodya, right? And so you realize that Putin is running by, and you can very clearly hear his name being and that's on purpose, right? I mean, we hear, Loznitsa put that in so that we hear it.
Two quick comments.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting choice to show us the procession of the everyday victims of the Soviet regime.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just the procession of pain. Well, like the mixed emotion.
Yeah.
But that was interesting. Two, it's no surprise that the Stalin documentary of his death is identical to Lenin, since he usurped everything, so it only makes
including
sense
the mausoleum.
so it makes perfect sense that it would end the way it began. practically. So
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that was a choice from Stalin's people, the children, anybody who represented him, and how much of it was his to replicate that.
I think it was the filmmakers.
Okay.
I think it was the filmmakers. And I think, yeah, I think the cinematic model was there and they just basically followed it.
Mm.
Or at least that's what I think, because I don't know where else they were. I don't know if they were getting directives on how the film was supposed to be made,
Mhm.
for sure. And I don't know what those were, because I have not looked into that.
Mhm.
But it is interesting, like sort of who made the choices and how and when. Yeah.
Because I'm
Yeah.
sorry, like you
Yeah.
said, like there's little things
Yeah.
that they just almost completely imitate from that.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
Yeah, so what I really love the overall structure to this, the fact that in these two cases, very parallel, you were able to take these contemporary documentaries that go back to the official state documentaries that you made
Yeah.
about them, and then trace that back to the historical. Once we've got these kind of three moments, which makes me wonder if like history doesn't always function actually in three moments. First is tragedy, then is farce, and then is a Loznitsa documentary.
Yes.
The other thought, like taking that back, though, literally taking it back, with the Lacanian point de capiton, the suturing moment,
Yeah.
which you gestured to at one point, and the ways in which this sutures meaning, but also does something really interesting to it. So Lacan has this idea that in every discourse like mine, all these words are coming out in a row. They could go anywhere until there's like a concluding moment, which
Right.
acts like the needle coming back with the thread
Right.
and kind of tying the discourse down. But what Loznitsa is doing here is reminding us that, of course, you can always do it again later on. You can always sort of pull that knot out and then loop
Right.
it back another time. And so that has the effect both of suturing the meaning down, though this is what the history really was, but also kind of opening it up in a really interesting way. And so what really struck
That's
me about this
interesting.
is that not only, so it's revisionist in one sense, but it's
Yeah.
also live. And the way that is most striking that's built into the first document you talked about was the stable camera.
Yeah.
That doesn't move for an hour and then
Right.
suddenly has to get up and run.
Right.
Because I haven't seen it, but I'm imagining my reaction as a spectator.
Right.
Would be like, what's happening, first of all, and then for the second hour of the film, is it gonna happen again? Right, and so suddenly now being in that position of like, this could go somewhere else one more time. That essentially you've taken that suturing gesture and then opened it up.
Yeah.
Anything could happen now.
Right.
Now the film is live.
Right.
Instead of history.
Right. And now Wyszynski can start coughing and never stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I had one crazy thought for you, the disrespectful thing with the overhead
Yeah.
shot of Stalin.
Yeah.
And all the flowers.
Yeah.
If you couple that with advertising slide from the film American Beauty, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It brings.
Understand what is uncanny
what's
about
uncomfortable
it.
and
Yeah.
intimate
Yeah.
about that scene.
Yeah.
Because there is another scene somewhere else that's always threatening to erupt. And it's
Yeah.
almost worse when it doesn't, like they keep looking at the body and we never get to see it.
Yeah.
That's a really effective way of kind of conjuring it up.
I'm seeing that there's a lot of, is somebody doing the
Chat
the
moderation.
chat, because I'm
There's a
seeing
chat,
there's a lot of chat.
Right.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
check the chat. If I can see.
Do you want me to do it?
Can you read it? I can see it's too small for me.
Yeah, we have a few questions.
Yeah.
The first one from Daniel Schwartz. What activity do you think Loznitsa expects from his spectators? I think here of a film like Austerlitz
Yeah.
that might implicate us in another kind of looking/gazing.
What activity? Okay, give me a couple more.
One from Anna Lenina.
Mhm.
Thank you very much for this remarkable presentation. I was very struck in your presentation about the participation of Vertov, Svilova, and Bilyakov in Stalin's hagiography, and the way in which Loznitsa then defamiliarizes their footage and their narrative using the avant-garde techniques pioneered by Vertov and Shub. Can you please say a few words about Vertov's and Kino members' commitment to creating hagiographic imagery and contributing to Stalin's cult of personality? And one more small comment from Anna Lenina. You have mentioned that there were so many documentary representations of Maidan, I wanted to mention a remarkable film by American-Ukrainian filmmaker Alena Onishko, Women of Maidan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Anna. What activity do I think he expects from the spectator? It's a good question. I guess I'm sticking to, rather than activity, I think I'm thinking that at least in part the realization of our own implication. So that's not exactly activity, but neither is it passivity, right? It's the notion that we are always part of the history that we are always part of the history that we are making. That is a tautology. We should not passively stand by and allow history to unfold itself the way that we have been passively standing by and allowing history to unfold.
What should we do differently?
I don't know. That's the question. Everyone take to the streets, but how and when? Immediately. But I do think that that's what he's getting at. That we have to recognize that we are in it, that we're not just bystanders. We're not, right? We can't just be on the sidelines, I think. But is it precisely activity? Does he want us to run out to the street and join Maidan? Maybe. That's at least some of it. Danny might have follow-ups. And for Anna, and thank you for the Ukrainian documentary. I mean, Vertov was very committed to Lenin. I don't think there's any question there. I think that when he makes Kino Pravda, the Lenin Kino Pravda, number 21, right? He's really mourning the passing of a great leader. And I think that by the time he's making Three Songs of Lenin 10 years later, things have changed radically in the USSR, and he's now really making it as mourning and trauma. It's a traumatic event of the things that have all the things that have been lost. By the time he's making Lullaby in 37, I'm not even sure he's the same Vertov anymore. He's trying, but he's been so displaced and so out of favor and power. But yeah, I mean, I think he actively participates and sculpts the memory of Lenin the same way that Mayakovsky did, right? Whom Vertov also loved. Yeah.
I have a question and a short comment. So with the state funeral, with this passing by, you explained with these multiple cameras, but the repetition of the faces, and it's quite obvious, I think it creates also the effect of theatralization, the effect of the merry-go-round.
Okay, yeah.
Kind of just circle and move it around.
Yeah. The always missing piece.
Yeah, it's circle.
Yeah.
But my question is about sort of the traditions or discourses that he's obviously opposing to. So for one, and correct me, I'm not a film scholar, I have a feeling that he tries to minimize the impression of montage. Of course, it's all montage, but he tries to make it look as if it's not montage, right? As if it's just one take as a montage, right?
Yeah.
Speech obviously reads as anti-Eisenstein and the same Vertov, of course.
Yeah.
Another tradition that he obviously is different from and opposing to is the tradition of this sort of political, historical, publicisticsky documentary, as epitomized by Mikhail Rom's "Обыкновенный фашизм," right?
Yeah.
Or with the very clear, sarcastic, ironic narrative.
You think he's anti that?
That's my question. There's no narrative in his films. There is no voice, right?
Right.
Except for the dialogue.
Yeah.
So why do you think so? Is it true? Am I misreading it?
So I think so I like the circular movement a lot, and because I think it does create this kind of carousel, this sort of endless procession. I mean, he really, right, again, he's taking he's got four days of footage, but he's really dragging it out. I mean, it's a sort of unbearable film in terms of length, right? And then he ends it, and then he ends it again, right? So there's something there. There's some sort of, we're saying goodbye for a really long time. So that I like, and I'll try to think about that more. The long take. So in the kind of fuller version of this thing, I talk a little bit more about Shub rather than just Vertov. And the difference between Shub and Vertov was precisely that Shub respected the historical documents. This is how people talked about her films in the 1920s, right? So she would always let the shot play itself out and wouldn't cut. And I think I think what he's getting from Shub is this respect for the length of the shot, and which leads to this minimalization of montage, right? He's not cutting, right? He's not doing any of that. He's doing exactly the opposite. He's really letting us see what the cameraman originally shot, right? What did it look like? And so you're absorbed in the sort of reality and realism of that process. So I think that's so it's still, so I'd say it's anti-Eisenstein Vertov, but it's still Soviet avant-garde, just a slightly different version. The narrative is interesting. So Soviet documentaries, particularly after from the 40s on, really, really strong narrative voice, right? And in fact, I guess that part got cut out of this talk. The original the original Great Farewell, the original movie of Stalin's funeral was what the voiceover is Yuri Levitan. So literally the voice of Stalin, right? The voice of the state, the main, he was the main radio narrator during World War II. And so so this is the voice that everyone would have recognized. And it's Yuri Levitan doing the voiceover for that film, for the original Stalin's funeral film. And of course, Loznitsa removes that entirely. And so the Soviet practice was a strong voice of God narration for all of these films. Vertov was already arguing against that and already said a good documentary doesn't need a narrator. So Loznitsa doesn't impose the authorial voice. What he does do is, as you saw at the end of both films, he gives you some final message from the author. So it does come, right? And of course, it comes in other ways as well. As I said, his uses of sound, right, which also direct us, into particular venues. Rom, I think, in Ordinary Fascism, was also doing an anti-Soviet voice.
Yes. It was very personal.
It's very.
It was his words.
It's very close mic'd. It's like he says he's having a conversation with the viewer. It's ironic. It's all. But yeah, Loznitsa is avoiding both of those. I think as the idea that again, a kind of Vertovian facts don't need narration.
But maybe it's also the other side of what we're talking about, the implicated subject. So the subject has to be implicated. The subject, the implication doesn't have to be moderated and mediated.
Yes, and in fact, by
the verbal.
Yeah.
I was also wondering whether the way he wants to engage the subject and to make them feel implicated is through affect, especially with the sequence where we heard the music mirroring the reaction in such a ideally synchronized way. It's almost melodramatization. It's literally the use of music and the affect on the screen to kind of involve us. So does he want to kind of like move away from the narrative, from the words, and use affect in this desire to implicate us?
I think so. In the sense that I think he's trying to do it again, not through verbal, right, but through visual and other cinematic means, including sound.
Excess,
right? Yeah.
So much excess.
And so much excess. Yeah.
And this, the smoothness of the camera.
But also the richness of
manipulation.
but also the richness of the colors, right? Everything is sort of but in that film, I feel like is meant to grab the
I
viewer's
think as an
attention.
audience, we
Yeah.
feel a little bit manipulated even in that scene.
Sure,
But
but
A
of
lot.
course.
I wondered if the
Yeah.
lack of narrative or the
Yeah.
emptiness or what
Yeah.
you feel is a form of protest. Because
Yeah.
any wrong move will get you killed.
Right,
And maybe that was
Yeah.
a way to speak to us through that.
Yeah.
You know.
the sort of,
mhm.
Yeah, it's particularly it's particularly evident when you watch the Politburo faces, right, where they're just standing there. There's one guy who's crying, who's, I forget his name. I have a picture of him somewhere, he ended up being sent to Poland as you know what I'm talking about. He was a general in World War. He was a general in World War II, and then he ends up going to Poland to be the main. Yeah, and he's crying. He's in tears. I mean, he's just like completely broken down in tears. Yeah.
You have a take on how Loznitsa's the documentaries relate to his fictional and Shastin my God, just
Right.
this thing, like,
Yeah.
get a unified picture.
No, and he makes so many movies. He's a little bit, to me, he's a little bit like a lot. So I concentrate on just a small portion of the documentaries, but he's not a happy filmmaker. Yeah. But he likes observational, right? That's part of his. It's just, again, and that's back to set up the camera and just watch. Right. And he likes just, people walking in front of the camera, people looking at the camera, people engaging or not engaging, but just sort of capturing life unawares. We're going to go back to Vertov briefly. Yeah.
So do you have a sense of where he stands on like complicity in in the current war? So, are all Russians complicit?
No, and I think that was why he got into a giant fight with the Ukrainian film industry.
So he's
no. So, well, again, and I don't know what I don't have any statements from him more recently, right? This was right after the Russians invaded. He first got into a major fight with the European film industry, right? Because they were
or they wanted to.
No. The European one, he expelled himself.
Oh, yeah.
Because their statement about the war wasn't strong enough. But then they went, super strong and decided not to show any Russian films and Russian directors. And then he made a statement against that. And then that's when the Ukrainians expelled him. And when I was first working on this, when you looked at Wikipedia, so he's got, I think it's, 13 or 26 entries, maybe 13 different entries, and all of them listed him as a Ukrainian filmmaker, except the Ukrainian one, which listed him as a Russian filmmaker. It's been recorrected back to Ukrainian, but there was a moment where they were like, you are not one of us. But he shows specifically Maidan and Donbass all over. He tours with them to collect money for the war effort. Yeah. So I mean, he didn't want, and again, I think my take on it is I think he thinks like a post-Soviet subject still, right? So he doesn't want to be nationalist. Mm-hmm. He wants to have moved past it, but we've moved past the post-Soviet into the new nationalist. And so we can no longer right now, that's not a space that's available anymore.
Is that right?
Well, I don't know, but
I don't know
seems to be.
I mean, I don't know if that's right.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's true that it's not in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And maybe not in Russia.
Yeah.
But so I'm asking this because the implicated subject is neither victim nor perpetrator.
Yeah.
But in a way that makes it like perpetrator, right? And
a little bit.
I mean,
it's not us. We didn't actually actively do it, right? I mean, part of Rothberg's point is that we weren't even there,
Right.
but but we benefit from,
Right.
right? We benefit from US slavery. We all do, right?
It's a lower category than
Yeah.
implicit,
Yeah,
but it's above innocent, if you will.
yeah.
Somewhere in that continuum.
Right, so it's incredibly interesting category to me. I'm not familiar with the work, so I'm really interested in it. But especially because I don't know. I don't know if if that position exists, I guess. That once if you're not a victim, if you are implicit in some way and benefit in some way,
Right.
implicit in some way,
Right.
and benefit in some way.
Right.
Doesn't that make you complicit? Does that make you complicit? What does that mean?
Right.
And I
But
think
it's different from even being in that courtroom, right? It's different from saying, все расстрелять. Right? You and I are not saying все
Right.
расстрелять, right?
exactly.
Let's kill them all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A good example
just-
that Rothberg gives is
Yeah.
like, what about somebody who moves to maybe even a migrant who moves to Germany and becomes a German citizen today? They're clearly not complicit in the Holocaust, certainly not a perpetrator of the Holocaust, but as a German citizen, aren't they in some way, we need a new category for this,
Benefiting from.
implicated
Right.
in the Holocaust?
We're having that conversation in America right now.
Absolutely.
Beneficiaries of
That's-
white
Yeah,
supremacy.
Yeah.
so same conversation.
Black people also be beneficiaries. I mean, everybody benefits.
Well, unless they
Mm.
don't.
I'm from Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting.
All right, colleagues, so if there is no more questions or comments, thank you, Lilya. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Forgot to say the magic
Thank you.
words that this is, of course, a work in progress.
We don't believe.
His issues with the Ukrainian industry remind me, you remember Freedom Prize?
Yes,
What is it?
exactly.
Remember that?
Yeah. I do remember Freedom Prize.
Yeah.